What if the reason your peace keeps changing around one particular person is not because you're overthinking, but because your spirit is recognizing what your mind keeps excusing? Sit with that for a moment, because many people spend months, sometimes years, trying to reason their way out of what their spirit noticed in minutes. They tell themselves they are imagining things. They call it stress, sensitivity, or emotional instability. They try to be mature, fair, and understanding. But while they are busy explaining everything away, their peace keeps telling the truth. Maybe that has been your experience lately. Around one particular person, something in you shifts. Nothing dramatic has to happen. No obvious argument. No direct betrayal. No loud disrespect. Sometimes the conversation seems normal on the surface, and yet afterward you feel strangely drained. You were fine before the interaction, clear in your mind, steady in your energy, maybe even hopeful. But after talking to them, something feels heavy. Your thoughts get noisier. Your emotions get harder to read. Your peace slips just enough to make you question yourself. And because there is no obvious evidence, you keep trying to give the situation the benefit of the doubt. You may have noticed that you feel uneasy around this person, and then immediately judge yourself for feeling that way. You may leave certain conversations feeling emotionally off for no clear reason. You may be completely fine when you are alone, calm when you are with God, centered when no one is pressing on your energy. But then after contact with this one person, even something small, you feel unsettled again. That pattern matters more than you think. Because peace does not usually disappear without a reason. And that is where the reframe becomes important. This is not paranoia. This is not random emotional instability. This may be discernment. Discernment is often much quieter than people expect. It does not always arrive with a dramatic revelation or a clear accusation. Sometimes it starts with a loss of peace. Sometimes it starts with tension in your body, fatigue in your spirit, confusion that was not there before, or a subtle but repeated discomfort you cannot fully explain. That does not mean every uncomfortable feeling is spiritual. But it also does not mean every uncomfortable feeling should be ignored. Some discomfort is simply anxiety, but some discomfort is mercy. Some discomfort is God not letting you relax in a place your spirit knows is not clean. That is why warnings from God are not always dramatic. Often they appear first as disturbance. Not fear, but interruption. Not panic, but heaviness. Not accusation, but a quiet signal that something in this connection is affecting you more deeply than you want to admit. The problem is that many people have been taught to distrust that early signal. They wait until something becomes obvious enough to justify their discomfort. They want proof before they allow themselves to respond. They want a dramatic moment, a clear offense, a visible betrayal, something that would make everyone else agree with what they have been feeling. But discernment rarely works that way. It usually comes before evidence, not after. It asks you to pay attention before the pattern becomes undeniable. That can be difficult, especially if you are someone who tries to see the good in others. You do not want to become suspicious. You do not want to accuse someone unfairly. You do not want to make a serious decision based on what feels, at first, like something invisible. So you keep excusing what your spirit keeps noticing. You tell yourself maybe they are just having a hard season. Maybe they do not mean it that way. Maybe you are the one who needs to calm down. And all the while your peace keeps slipping in their presence. This is why you need to hear this clearly. The issue may not be what he says. It may be what his presence keeps doing to your spirit. Some people affect you long before they reveal themselves openly. Some people carry an instability, a comparison, a hidden resentment, or a quiet manipulation that your mind cannot immediately name, but your spirit can absolutely feel. And if every encounter with them leaves you more confused, more fatigued, more self-doubting, or more spiritually crowded than you were before, then that pattern deserves your attention. Because God does not always warn you by exposing the person first. Sometimes he warns you by disturbing your peace. And if your peace keeps changing around the same person, that may not be something to brush off. That may be the beginning of clarity. Once you begin to recognize that loss of peace can be a signal the next question becomes important. How does someone actually pull you off course without you noticing it right away? Because in most real relationships, sabotage does not appear as an obvious attack. It rarely shows up as someone openly opposing you, insulting you, or trying to harm you directly. If it did, the decision to create distance would be easy. Instead, what makes these situations confusing is that the influence is subtle. It develops slowly, almost invisibly, until you suddenly realize that your clarity is not what it used to be. Sabotage in relationships often disguises itself as something harmless. Sometimes it looks like subtle comparison. Someone may casually mention another person who is doing something similar to what you are doing, but supposedly doing it better. They frame it as conversation, not criticism. Yet the effect is quiet but powerful. Instead of leaving the conversation feeling encouraged, you leave wondering whether what you are building is really that meaningful. Other times it comes in the form of disguised concern. The words sound supportive, but the energy underneath them weakens your confidence. You might hear things like, "I just don't want you to get hurt," or "maybe you should be careful with that idea." On the surface it sounds protective, but when that type of advice appears repeatedly, it slowly trains you to doubt your own direction. Another common pattern is emotional unpredictability. Some people alternate between moments of warmth and moments of distance. One day they celebrate you. The next day they seem withdrawn or irritated by your progress. That inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion is powerful because it keeps your attention focused on managing the relationship instead of focusing on your purpose. Then there is low-grade discouragement. This is not the loud negativity people usually warn you about. It is quieter. It appears in subtle reactions, hesitant responses, or conversations that slowly pull your attention away from what excites you. Over time, the emotional atmosphere around that person becomes slightly heavy. You do not feel openly attacked, but you do feel smaller. And perhaps the most influential factor of all is constant access to your inner world. When someone regularly has access to your thoughts, your plans, your fears, and your emotional state, they naturally gain influence over your direction. This is not always intentional, but proximity shapes perspective. The voices closest to you often affect how you interpret your own life. The Bible illustrates this dynamic in a powerful way through the story of Samson and Delilah. When people think about that story, they often imagine betrayal as a sudden act. But if you read the story closely, you see something different. Delilah did not defeat Samson through open warfare. She gained emotional access. She asked questions. She observed his habits. She patiently studied what made him vulnerable. The danger in that story was not immediate violence. It was the slow exchange of trust and information that eventually led Samson to reveal the very thing that protected him. This is how compromise often begins. Comfort slowly turns into vulnerability. Familiarity turns into influence. And influence turns into decisions that would have seemed impossible at the beginning. When someone has access to your fears, they know where your confidence is weakest. When they understand your emotional openings, they know how to shape conversations in ways that affect how you see yourself. Over time, that influence can quietly shift your perspective. The shift is rarely dramatic. It is gradual. One conversation plants a seed of doubt. Another conversation introduces hesitation. Another one subtly reframes your goals as unrealistic or unnecessary. The most important thing to understand is that this process does not always involve obvious malice. Many people who create these dynamics are not consciously trying to sabotage anyone. Sometimes they are simply struggling with their own insecurity. When someone around you begins to grow, change, or step into a new level of purpose, it can expose the places where they feel stuck. Instead of addressing that discomfort directly, they may try to bring the situation back to a level where they feel more stable. Psychologically, this is a form of self-protection. If someone feels threatened by another person's progress, minimizing that progress can restore their sense of balance. They may not realize they are doing it. They may even believe they are helping. But the result is the same. Over time, their influence drains your clarity. This is why the most dangerous influences are not always the loudest ones. Loud opposition is easy to recognize. You know where you stand with someone who openly disagrees with you. The more complicated situations are the ones where someone stays close enough to influence your thoughts while quietly weakening your confidence. The people who have the greatest impact on your life are rarely strangers. They are the ones who sit at your table, hear your plans, and share your conversations. Proximity amplifies influence. When the influence is healthy, it strengthens you. When the influence is misaligned, it slowly redirects you. And this leads to an important insight. Some people do not destroy your life through a single event. They do it through gradual confusion. They drain your clarity until you begin to question decisions that once felt obvious. They introduce just enough doubt that your momentum slows down. When that happens, the danger is not only what they say. The deeper issue is the level of access they have to your inner world. Because the voices that shape your thinking eventually shape your direction. Which brings us to a difficult but necessary realization. Sometimes the real problem is not simply someone's behavior. The deeper problem is how much influence they currently have over your life. By this point, the conversation naturally shifts to something deeper than the other person's behavior. Because once you start recognizing subtle influence and the way certain relationships affect your clarity, you begin to realize something important. The deepest issue is not only who that person is. The deeper issue is how much access they have to your life. Access is powerful. The people who regularly have access to your thoughts, your emotions, your plans, and your doubts inevitably shape the way you see yourself. They may not intend to influence you, but proximity always creates influence. When someone consistently hears what you're thinking, what you're struggling with, and what you're building, their responses begin to affect how you interpret your own direction. This is why boundaries are not about punishment. Boundaries are about stewardship, protecting the environment where your clarity grows. Many people only begin to recognize this when they notice certain patterns repeating in their relationships. One sign that someone may have too much access is that you find yourself constantly explaining your decisions to them. Instead of simply sharing what you are doing, you feel the need to justify it. You explain why you made a certain choice, why you believe something will work, why you feel called to a particular direction. And even after explaining, you leave the conversation feeling less certain than before. The explanation was not enough to protect your confidence. Another sign appears when you start shrinking your excitement around that person. Think about the last time something good happened in your life. Did you feel completely free to celebrate it around them? Or did you quietly reduce the intensity of your joy so it would not make them uncomfortable? When you begin to edit your own enthusiasm, it usually means the relational environment no longer supports your growth. Sometimes the shift is even more subtle. You may begin to feel watched instead of supported. The conversation does not feel like a space where you can think out loud and explore possibilities. Instead, it feels like your decisions are being evaluated. You become more careful with your words. You measure how much you reveal. And slowly, the relationship becomes less about connection and more about managing impressions. Over time, the emotional cost of that dynamic becomes clear. You leave interactions feeling drained instead of strengthened. You start to replay conversations in your mind, wondering if you said too much or if you should have kept certain things to yourself. And perhaps the most telling sign appears when you notice that decisions that once felt clear now feel uncertain. You begin to second-guess choices that you were confident about before the conversation happened. When those patterns show up together, it often means someone has access to your inner world that is no longer healthy for the season you are entering. This realization does not require you to label the person as malicious. It simply requires you to recognize the effect of their proximity. The Bible provides an interesting illustration of this principle in the story of Jonah. When Jonah tried to avoid the direction God had given him, he boarded a ship heading the opposite way. The sailors on that ship were simply doing their job. They were experienced travelers, navigating the sea the way they always had. Yet suddenly, a violent storm rose around them. The wind intensified. The waves grew chaotic. Everyone on the ship felt the danger, even though most of them had done nothing wrong. Eventually, the sailors realized that the storm was connected to Jonah's presence on the ship. It was not that the other passengers were evil or incompetent. The problem was alignment. One person on that vessel was moving in a direction that conflicted with the direction God had already established. And that misalignment created turbulence for everyone involved. This story illustrates a powerful principle. Sometimes storms continue not because everyone involved is wrong, but because someone is out of place in the direction you are traveling. Their presence may have made sense in a previous season. Their companionship may have been natural when your life was moving through a different environment. But when your direction changes, alignment becomes more important than familiarity. This is why wisdom does not always require dramatic proof before it responds. Many people wait for clear betrayal before adjusting their relationships. They tell themselves that unless someone does something obviously wrong, they have no right to create distance. But maturity understands something deeper. You do not need evidence of evil to recognize misalignment. Sometimes the clearest signal is simply the effect a person's presence has on your peace, your clarity, and your sense of direction. When the same interaction repeatedly leaves you confused, drained, or doubtful about decisions that once felt steady, that pattern deserves attention. This leads to a difficult but honest realization. Some storms continue because the wrong passenger is still on your boat. Not because that person is evil. Not because they are intentionally trying to sabotage your life. But because their presence, their influence, or their emotional posture is no longer aligned with where you are going. Recognizing that truth requires maturity. It asks you to move beyond blaming someone else and instead examine the access you have allowed. It invites you to consider whether the environment around your calling still supports the direction you are meant to walk. And it prepares you for the next step of the conversation, which is understanding why God sometimes changes the people who walk beside you as your season begins to change. Once you begin to recognize misalignment, another important question naturally arises. Why does God sometimes allow certain relationships to fade or shift just before something new begins in your life? Many people assume that when distance forms between them and someone they once cared about, it must mean something went terribly wrong. They look for betrayal, conflict, or some clear moment that explains the change. But in many cases, the explanation is far simpler and far more common than people realize. Sometimes relationships change because seasons change. Not every connection in your life was designed to last forever. Some relationships are seasonal. They appear during a particular chapter of your journey and serve a purpose while that chapter unfolds. Some are instructional. They help you learn something important about yourself, your boundaries, or your values. Others are transitional. They walk with you through a time of uncertainty or growth, helping you move from one stage of life into another. But when the season changes, the relationship that made sense before may no longer align with the direction you are heading now. Understanding this removes the need to turn someone into a villain just to justify moving forward. Many people feel that if they are going to create distance from someone, they must first prove that the person is toxic or malicious. But maturity recognizes something deeper. A relationship does not have to be destructive in order to become misaligned. Two people can both be sincere, both be well-intentioned, and still no longer belong in the same direction. The Bible gives a powerful illustration of this principle in the story of Ruth. Ruth's life began in Moab, surrounded by the people and environment she had always known. It was familiar. It was predictable. It was the place where her story had started. But when Naomi prepared to return to Bethlehem, Ruth faced a moment of decision. She could remain in Moab, surrounded by what felt comfortable and familiar, or she could leave that environment behind and move towards something she could not yet fully see. Ruth's decision required courage because leaving Moab meant leaving what she knew. It meant stepping into uncertainty. Yet she understood something essential. She could not stay where destiny was no longer growing. The place that once held her life was no longer the place where her future would unfold. Familiarity had to be left behind in order for alignment to take its place. This is where many people struggle emotionally. They believe that moving forward means rejecting the past or condemning the people who were part of it. But Ruth did not leave Moab because she hated the people there. She left because her direction had changed. The environment that once supported her life could no longer support the next chapter of her story. The same principle applies to many relationships. You do not have to hate someone to outgrow the dynamic you once shared. Growth naturally changes compatibility. As your priorities shift, as your faith deepens, and as your sense of purpose becomes clearer, the type of environment you need in order to grow begins to change as well. This is why not everyone who walked with you in the wilderness is meant to walk with you into the promised land. The wilderness is a place of survival and learning. It is where identity forms and resilience develops. But the promised land represents something different. It requires alignment, stability, and the ability to build something new. And sometimes the people who helped you survive one season are not equipped to walk with you into the next one. When this happens, it does not mean someone failed you or that you failed them. It simply means the assignment of that relationship has reached its conclusion. God does not only remove people who are clearly toxic. Sometimes what he removes is misaligned access. He adjusts proximity so that the environment around your life matches the direction he is calling you to follow. The key insight to hold on to is this: some people are not bad. They are simply no longer right for where God is taking you. And recognizing that truth allows you to move forward without bitterness, without accusation, and without unnecessary guilt. Because when God prepares to open new doors, he often first adjusts the company that walks beside you. As we close this message, it's important to understand what freedom in this situation actually looks like. Because many people imagine freedom as something dramatic. They picture a confrontation, a long explanation, or a moment where everything is finally said out loud. But in reality, the kind of freedom God often leads you into is much quieter than that. It doesn't always come with arguments or final speeches. Most of the time, it arrives as clarity. Freedom begins when you stop fighting the signal your peace has been giving you. Instead of constantly analyzing the relationship or trying to prove something is wrong, you simply recognize what is happening inside your spirit. The confusion fades, not because the other person suddenly changes, but because you no longer try to force harmony where alignment is missing. That clarity leads to emotional peace. And emotional peace is very different from temporary comfort. Comfort sometimes asks you to ignore what you feel in order to maintain familiarity. Peace, on the other hand, allows you to be honest about what your spirit is experiencing. When you are walking in peace, you are no longer constantly adjusting your energy to keep someone else comfortable. You are not measuring every word or wondering how your progress will be received. Your presence becomes natural again. Spiritual alignment follows that peace. When the environment around your life begins to match the direction God is leading you, your energy returns. Your focus becomes clearer. Decisions that once felt complicated begin to feel simple again. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the internal friction is gone. Often the most practical change that happens in this process is reduced access. Freedom does not always mean cutting someone out of your life completely. Sometimes it simply means they no longer have the same level of influence they once had. The conversations change. The emotional access changes. The space they occupy in your thoughts becomes smaller. And when that shift happens, certain habits quietly disappear. You stop explaining your discernment to people who cannot feel what you feel. You stop forcing connection just to maintain history. And you stop carrying guilt for outgrowing a dynamic that once made sense but no longer does. Looking back, the story often becomes clearer than it felt in the moment. What once felt like a warning begins to reveal itself as mercy. What once felt like distance begins to look like protection. And what once felt like loss often turns out to be alignment. Space being made for the people, opportunities, and environments that truly support the direction of your life. If this message resonated with you today, take a moment to acknowledge the clarity you are stepping into. Like this video if you choose peace over confusion. Subscribe to Chosen by God for faith messages that are grounded, mature, and spiritually sharp. And if this message spoke directly to your situation, leave a comment below and write, "I protect my peace." Because sometimes the greatest shift in life does not come from discovering new information. It comes from finally trusting what your spirit has been telling you all along. And remember this as you move forward. God doesn't warn you about people so you become suspicious. He warns you so you stop sacrificing peace to keep the wrong connection alive.